first off, thank you everybody for joining us today and taking some time to catch up on some professional development. Today, we'll be looking at the whole concept of like designing lessons that stick. Now, when it means stick, it's not the proverbial stick, it's designing a lesson that's going to stick with our students and something that is going to make sure that we increase engagement and ultimately learning within our lessons. So today's topic. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about who I am, why should we take a critical look at our planning, how we can start to plan for success, and what can I actually be using to use this the very next day. But a little bit about myself first. So my name's Jace Ferguson. I'm the founder of Tin Can Physical Education. I have my Bachelor of Education from the University of Alberta from back in 2006. And since then, I've been working throughout the entire different realm of physical education, all the way from kindergarten up to grade 12. I've also received my master's degree in Master of Science, Recreation and Sports Science from Ohio University in 2013. And I've also been kind of all over the world. I started my teaching career in Canada. I since then have done some experience in the UAE, working at some American international schools. And currently I'm in Macau, which is just outside of Hong Kong, working in a Canadian international school. I've also kind of taken a role, a little bit of administration as well. From about 2013, I started actually getting involved into physical education leadership. I was part of the HPEC Council in Alberta, and actually currently I'm part of the PHE Canada mentorship program for teachers, and also internationally as well, working with such organizations such as FASE, ACHPER, and also some organizations in the UAE as well. Now, you can also find me in a few different places. On Twitter, I do a lot of sharing, a lot of posting on Twitter. You can find me at Grant Muchacho. Also social media as well. So Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube at Tin Can Phys Ed. You can also find me on my website at tincanphysed.com. Now, why is planning such an important piece? Now, I was told this very early in my career, and I want to say it was from Robert Plowman. He was one of my first administrators I worked with, or was it from Bradley Harrop? He was one of the first heads of department I've ever worked with. And they mentioned this to me, and they said something along the lines of, people don't plan to fail, they just fail to plan. Now, this has stuck with me for such a long time. And even to this day, in this far into my career, I still remember these words quite clearly. It is something that is just the truth. Like, we don't plan to fail, we just fail to plan and plan for engagement. And we fail to just kind of do those things. If a lesson falls flat, there are some things, but sometimes we need to look at how we did it and how we prepared for it in our planning. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the first thing we need to look at is starting to challenge that traditional thought. Now, I've actually been playing around with this idea for the past couple years, and like, what does quality physical education look like? And for me, it comes down to looking at activity and movement, health and wellness literacy, and sport and physical literacy as well. These things all work together to create a quality learning experience. If these are all part of a quality learning experience, how are we going to be reflecting that in our planning? How are we going to be reflecting that into our lessons? Because our lessons are a direct result of the thoughts and processes that go into our planning. So what we're going to be doing today is actually taking a look at how we could actually get these three dimensions of learning into a lesson. We also need to start looking at some traditional thoughts around planning. Now, the number one thing is this is a must be done. Sometimes we're given, you need to do it this way, which sometimes that's just for documentation, but it also gives that lack of flexibility. It also assumes that learning is pressure. We are forcing learning, we're forcing a concept onto students through very rigid and very linear planning. This is also the whole concept of this needs to be done this way. Like, with teaching, there is no right way. There are many different pedagogical approaches going out this way. How we apply those definitely comes from how we plan to use those within our lessons. Linear steps. People often think learning happens, we need to go here, then we need to go this way, that we do this, then we do this, and often we can't go back. Or that old phrase, like, it's time to move forward. I hear that often throughout, I've said that early in my career. I've also heard that through schools. It's time to move forward. Are we doing a service to our students if we're just moving forward, not knowing if they've had it, not giving the proper learning checks to make sure that they understand those concepts? Also, some of us just kind of look at it as like easy peasy. Like, we've done it once, I'm good. I don't need to reflect on this and take a look at it again. It also needs to be kind of like that lack of structure. Like, well, what does a good lesson plan look like? What does planning for a high quality lesson actually look like? And then that organic and natural learning. What does this look like? How do we plan the organic of learning in there? Now, organic learning is when there's accountability, there's engagement, there's student voice, there's student choice. How do we make this organic and natural learning happen where the students are kind of being part of the process, not just being delivered a product? And then we obviously have the stereotype around Mr. Woodcock and the lack of professional value. If you haven't seen Mr. Woodcock, it's a video with Billy Bob Thornton. It came out, I want to say, in the early 2000s. And it's just a stereotypical roll out the ball PE teacher who does not set up a really caring environment much at all. But we've been having to look at that lack of value, the lack of professional growth, and also the lack of current research. People think that there's not a lot of research out there, but there is. There's a lot of pedagogical research. There's a lot of documentation out there about what are some best practices to be using, what are some best models to be using, and also what are the best processes to be using to design our lessons. Because ultimately, we don't want to be this guy here. So this is actually a quote right from Mr. Woodcock. PE is much more than running laps. We need to make it meaningful. We need to make it valuable. And this comes from the quality of planning that we put into our lessons, into our classes, into our program. If we don't do those things, it does just become running a lap. It does just become a place where kids just play and move, and it lacks that whole meaning and purpose. So how do you plan for success? So what do I need? So there's actually 3 parts when you're trying to plan for a successful lesson that's full of engagement. Part 1 is your program vision and direction. You need to know where you want to go. That could be a totally different webinar process. We're not going to talk about that much today, but having a clear vision on what does learning look like in your classroom, in your program, what happens here and should look into here. How does a student progress through this learning experience while they're inside your school and inside your program? Part 2 is also quality units of exploration. Now that you have your vision and your direction down, what do the units actually look like? And instead of just looking at, well, we're just going to play basketball. Okay, what are we looking at what's going on behind the curtain? What's going on above and beyond just playing the game? That type of quality unit exploration and scaffolding really flows into the 3rd part, which we're going to talk about today, which is purposeful instructional flow. How do we design a lesson that has purpose, that has a flow, that is natural, that is organic, that also encourages students to be part of the process and to progress and learn in a way that's meaningful to them? So today we're going to be actually talking about part 3. I've done a few webinars on the units, and I've also done webinars on program vision and direction. But today we're going to be focusing on just a lesson design and having that purposeful instructional flow. So when I think of purposeful instructional flow, this is actually how my brain works. Now, this isn't the most clear way, but we're going to actually break this down. And in the end, I'm actually going to give you a template for instructional design where you can actually take this process that I do for every class and you could actually apply to any class. Now, this doesn't just work in PE. This works in any classroom, any organization, any situation where you are working with people to help them learn and grow. So the one thing about this design is it doesn't end. It always circles back on itself. We go through the steps, we go through the process. It always comes back and circles in as the process carries on. So that's the one thing about this process is it doesn't just end. There's not just a clear end point. This is a circular, cyclical function where there's always involvement and growth. But let's talk about the hook. So the first thing we talk about is the hook. So this is where we're grabbing and focusing our engagement with our students. Now, this is where the first 10 minutes of any situation are critical. This is if you don't have the attention, if you don't have the purpose cemented within those first 10 minutes, you are going to be in an uphill battle. And to cement that purpose is really simple. We need to address the 3 questions, like why are we learning this? Why are we doing this? What is the whole purpose? What is the reason behind it? And then after we take a look at that, how are we going to have everybody else involved except being just a participant? How are you going to have other people involved where they are part of the process, not just being delivered the product, but part of the process as well. And then what are some previous learning connections? What have you learned in the past? What previous skills or experiences have you had that connects to what we're going through in this time and space at this moment? So this is where in those first 10 minutes, we really need to set up that hook, establishing what's going on. Now, how you do this can be very different. Some of us may be doing this through activities where we kind of look back on previous learning. Some of this may be a chalk talk type situation. Now, the hook is going to look different for every situation, but within those first 10 minutes, you're really trying to establish why are we learning this? How are we involved besides just being a participant? And what are some previous learning connections that we've had in the past that are going to tie into what we're doing today? From that hook, we actually move into like the cycle of teaching. So the cycle of teaching looks a lot of fun. It's involved playing, it's involving use. Then we go to a teachable moment. Then how do we build and progress? How do we go back to a teaching moment again? So this is where we could often spend our entire time running our lesson is actually going through this process. But what does actually play look like? So play doesn't always mean just running around freely and aimlessly. It's actively focused on the learning. So again, why are we playing or doing this? If we're doing some sort of game, how does this tie into our hook? How does this tie into the reason why we're here today? And then how can we use progressions that drives learning? We need to also be aware that we have students that are on the entire spectrum of abilities and skills. So how can we use progressions to challenge the students who are higher end, but also how can we use progressions that still keep our students at the lower end still engaged? And then how can we also have students just be more than just participants? Anybody in a learning situation loves it when they are part of the learning process. We're talking adults, we're talking students, we're talking children, and everybody loves being part of the process. So how can we get our students and our participants to be just more than people being delivered a product? How can we have them part of the process? And then what can we do to increase or decrease the challenge? What can happen to progress or degress to get those students with those people at the lower end? How do we get those people at the higher end? So this is where we need to really look at our play design. And then from play, we actually move into the next stage, which is a teachable moment. To have any sort of activity is great, but how does this tie into a teachable moment in feedback? So those teachable moments, this is where you have that instruction and feedback. This can be during gameplay. This can be a sit and talk for 5 minutes or have a class meeting or a session meeting. But this is where you are giving instruction and feedback. The number one thing about this is this does not have to be teacher focused. This could be student driven, student directed as well. And that comes with some setting of some processes where we can have students being part of that process. Now, with your teachable moments in instruction and feedback, we need to keep it positive and specific. What are you seeing or what should be taking a look at to give feedback that fosters growth? So this is where we need to create some critical questions that we're going to be taking a look at. Having feedback focused is critical. It's just like keeping score. If you don't know how to score in a game, people aren't going to try to play it. So if you don't know how to get feedback or what you're looking for to receive feedback, that's where we need to really focus on our critical questions, establishing critical questions that are connected to some sort of learning outcome. But the number one thing is students are going to be the stars of this moment. This moment is all for them. This is for them to receive some feedback, to progress, to grow, and to make that learning actually take place and happen. Now, from that teachable moment, we could actually move into a little bit of progress. Like, how do we build from that? So progress, how do we use progressions to drive engagement? So the lesson's obviously building towards a focus. Every lesson, every type of learning experience should be focused on one thing. I need to get to this point. I'm here. How do I get there? And this is where progressions come in. So this is where we can be using to increase challenge or to create a fresh perspective, maybe introducing something new. But the big thing in there is like, this is where we're differentiating our instruction for our students. No matter if it's an art class, a social class, a PE class, our students are going to be learning in different ways. And this is where we need to really differentiate that. How do we create different opportunities for our students to engage and show learning? Now, if we have this differentiation, you're going to see students want to be part of the process, to be part of the process. But it's all about designing how do we get that differentiation in this learning experience. We need to be really conscious of that as well. Now, this cycle can continue to go on and on and on for quite some time. You could spend an entire class looking at this, or you could spend an entire 10 minutes in this cycle. It's only really up to the people you're working with. This is a really tailor-made sequence where if the students have gone through the cycle and they've shown great growth, okay, then maybe we can look to leave this teaching cycle. But if they need more time, maybe we spend more time with it. So this is where we need to be really focused on, flexible on our students' needs and our participants' needs. Are they getting what they need to get from this learning experience? When they leave from that, the number one thing we need to do is look at our closure. How are we closing and creating a clear endpoint? So lessons are like, I use this quote, lessons are like people, they need closure to grow. Whenever something happens as an individual, we need to have closure to learn it, to move on from it. But lessons are like that. We need to close our lessons. And sometimes I see closure is just rushed. It's not really conscious. It's not really purposeful. It's just, hey, that was a great day today, everyone. Have a good day. We need to celebrate the progress. We also need to address the struggles and embrace the failures. One thing I've started to notice with our students, even with working with adults as well, is when we start to embrace failures and look at those as teachable learning moments, you can see the power of learning just grow. We definitely need to be addressing the struggles. It's something that happens. It's part of the learning process, but also embracing those failures and showing what we can move forward from that point. From that closure, then we look at reflection. How are we going to take this and make it personal? So reflection, so how have I changed? So meaningful reflection is priceless. I've worked with students, this is my 15th year working with students, and reflection has always been one of the most difficult things because in the past it has been valued, but they don't really know how to do it. So setting up meaningful reflection is going to be crucial and priceless. This is where you create that enduring understanding and those connections, those personal connections with the outcome or the focus that you have. This is also where you can document and have students be part of the process of documenting successes or failures as learning moments. What have they been doing to make this a learning experience? What are some failures they had to overcome, or what are some obstacles, and what are some successes that they've had to be part of this process to celebrate their learning? This is where we need to really look at that reflection process. Now, I've kind of quickly unpacked what this looks like, and this is kind of like the whole process I look at when I look at lesson design and designing lessons that really drive student engagement. But what does this actually look like? So what are some practical applications? It's nice to see a diagram, but what would be an actual application that you could walk away with and use starting tomorrow? So I've actually broken down and created a little bit of a template. So when I look at my lesson design, I obviously look through these different areas of learning and look at the different areas connecting it to meaning, connecting to purpose, but also to connect to a hook and a closure. So we're gonna actually go through, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but working from our left to our right, we actually have a little column, then we actually go into our learning activities, which is our lesson, okay, the focus. Why are we learning this? Obviously under our lesson, we want to really drive home the point. Why are we learning this? Why are we here today? What is the object of this lesson? And underneath that, break down the objectives. What are specifically that we're looking at? Are we looking at developing a certain understanding? Are we looking at developing a certain skill? What is going to be happening so we can actually give qualitative and quantitative feedback directed at our objectives? And then our resources, what do we need? Obviously our time and direction, our assessment tools, what do we need to use to give feedback back to our students? And then once we have kind of like the logistics behind that, all right, how am I going to hook? How am I going to hook attention with our students, with the people being involved? And then what am I going to look at to reflect and close the lesson? What type of process? And this could be connected to the hook. This could be connected to whatever you want it to be, but how am I going to reflect and close? And then from there, we look at our learning activities. Now, I like to call them progressions 1, 2, and 3. It really drives home the whole idea of to progress and to build off one another. Now, within each progress, you're going to see that there's 3 other subsections. So there's key points. What are the key things to be looking at in this progression? What are some critical questions that are going to guide some feedback? And then how are we going to put in some differentiation and progression? within that part of the lesson, how are we going to make things a little bit more challenging, or how are we going to decrease the challenge to keep everybody engaged and kind of hit that sweet spot of student engagement and success, but still experiencing some challenge. So what does this actually look like in terms of use? So this is an example from my fielding and striking unit. This is just on my example. So this is my very first lesson. Introduction to fielding and striking games. So what do we here? Establish routine, roles, and responsibilities, kind of talk about what we're going to be doing. And now the specific objectives. So I'm going to be looking to see if our students are selecting a level of engagement that best fits their abilities. Are they also supporting teammates when not directly involved in play? Do they know how to cover each other, playing cutoff? Following the rules of gameplay, can they follow the rules of the games? Can they follow the directions and kind of follow norms as well? And demonstrate sportsmanship and respect. So those are the 4 things I'm really looking for in terms of like the student behavior, student actions. What are the resources I need? I need a whiteboard, I need some pylons, some jerseys, rubber chickens, some batting tees, 4 bats or rackets, some tennis balls and hula hoops. Now, how long does this look like? This could be 2 40-minute classes or 1 large 80-minute classes. I usually, like, my lessons are 80-minute lessons, so I can either do this, but I could also break it down into 2 separate lessons. Now, my assessment tools. I'm obviously going to be linking this to my unit rubric, which is, okay, here's our fielding striking rubric. I'm going to be linking that to this, but I also have something called a fielding and striking report, which I do use at the end, and I'll talk about where I use that in the end. But ultimately, it's like a Google Sheet where the students assess themselves where they're at and how they have done. And then let's look at the hook. So creating student-generated outcomes. So this is one thing I do use to kind of hook the students with the unit. So this is where they explore and unpack what we've already know about the fielding and striking unit. This is where they also identify personal goals and ways to demonstrate those things. So this is where I unpack the entire unit with our students, but this is where I'm also hooking their attention. I'm having them part of the process. You can actually see that I put the hook in progression number 1. So we have like a little bit of a chalk talk. So students get to create and design their own outcomes and statements. But then also they get to show what they already know. What is going on that they can understand, and how can they do that? And then the teacher draws the diagram on the whiteboards. We're using the whole process. There's even a link on the little pieces of papers that shows what the process looks like. But the whole idea is the critical question. So what should students be able to demonstrate at the end of the unit to show learning? Really focusing, okay, what is the whole point of this? How am I going to be giving feedback? How do students know that they're successful? They should be able to answer this critical question. And then our differentiation and progress. So maybe allow students to take a look at the unit guide, maybe have them printed out beforehand, things like that. But then I look at the next progression, which is chuck the chicken. So this is just, again, a simple gameplay. It's actually focused around just like looking at throwing and catching skills. But I've also linked that as well. So to play the warm-up game to evaluate what students already know about fielding and striking games. So this is just a really highly modified game of baseball. Students should be demonstrating proper base running, proper throwing techniques, safe fielding position. I have in there what students should be demonstrating and performing in that lesson. But the key points are communicating, working together, and having them showcase what can they do. And that really ties into our critical question. How can I demonstrate that I know how to play this dimension of game? How can I show everybody that I know how to play fielding and striking games? Or I could use the skills behind fielding and striking games. And then the differentiation aspect. So we could be using a bat and tennis ball. We could be, instead of a rubber chicken, we can make progressions if our students' skill are higher to increase the challenge. Or we could take a knee until the batter sends the object to give the batters a little bit of advantage as well. So what type of progressions could we be using to make this experience more challenging for those students with higher skill level, or lower for those students that are just learning this game as well? And then with our third build, 4-corner baseball. So ultimately all these activities are building to the outcome. Okay, we're establishing routines, roles, and responsibilities, but really showing that we can follow rules of gameplay, demonstrating sportsmanship, and also selecting a level of engagement that best fits their abilities. All these tie into those objectives of that lesson. But again, for that third activity, showing off what they can do safely. Can they adjust or modify their skills? This is where I get to really take a look at what are students at this point, so we can make an assessment and plan for future lessons. Now, the next lesson about that, so this is a new one. So after that lesson, I maybe look at cricket developmental games and go through the exact same process as well. Outlining, okay, why are we learning this, developing the game sense of fielding and striking games. My objectives have changed just a little bit, so applies terminology. So we're gonna be talking about terminology for building and striking games, creating ways for others to be part and involved. This is where we're taking and building upon that lesson that is happening. We could take a look at what do we need. Okay, we need pylons, we need jerseys, our assessment tools. Now the hook. The one thing if I'm going to say is if you're planning a sequence of lessons, don't reinvent the wheel every time. Connect back to previous learning. So if this is the second lesson in my unit, I'm going to go back and use that game that they learned the first class because they should be able to show me their understanding and learning from that first lesson inside this simple hook. So we could go review and check our understanding from our last lesson. But then we also look at it and we reflect and close at the end. We use that to look at our personal reflection. This is where I actually bring up that fielding scouting report, where students are going to access their scouting report and give themselves an evaluation on their demonstrated skills. Are they demonstrating these skills at a level they think? Now, that's a great tool for me because I could go back and see, okay, what do I see? What do you see? What do I see? And we can actually compare and contrast, and opens up the door for conversations. But then we look at our activities again. Again, we have our warm up, but then we progress into something a little bit more focused, which is developing that game sense, where we play smaller sided games like kick it cricket, where again, we're moving towards the ball to field it. We're working on specific skills to play fielding striking games, but then we're looking at those critical questions. How can you combine tracking an object and receiving it and then throwing it under control? How do we put all these things together? How do we focus our learning to be progressive, to be purposeful? And that's really where the importance of the critical questions do come in. And then we finally end it with our activity, kick it cricket, which is, can I hit a moving object while under control? Can they increase or decrease the difference behind? All those things. So we're really being purposeful and mindful of all the things that our students should be demonstrating, but they also, how are they part of this process as well? And that's where we look at our personal reflection. That's where we look at our critical questions. Those could be conversations or learning moments where you can have the students have those conversations with each other. Okay, well, why are these concepts important for a healthy lifestyle? Why should we be learning this game? And having those conversations as well, having the students part of that process. Now, those have just been some two examples of how I've used this whole process to design and make learning and engagement and fun. So this is where it really takes that whole purpose. Now, how long does this actually take me when I sit down and plan this? After doing this for a few years, this has been very, very simple because we all have the activities, but the time that you put into this is really going to be beneficial towards the outcome, which is creating a meaningful and engaging process where students who are there, they understand why they're there, and they understand the importance of being engaged and being part of the process as well. So I've kind of unpacked that. You can actually find those resources. I've actually given a link, and I'll send out an email, and I'll send an email comment. I'll put a link in the description as well. But you can access those templates free of charge on my Teachers Pay Teachers site. The QR code up at the top corner can actually put you onto a mailing list if you're interested in being part of the mailing list and just receiving updates on resources, updates on PD opportunities. It's a great place to kind of just have information directly delivered to your email inbox. Thank you for joining us and catching this webinar on YouTube. Don't forget to hit and like that channel and click on the links for more information about how to access all the materials covered. Have a great day.